Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive?
Definitely.
Awesome. Today, we're tackling some pretty intense stuff. Christian persecution around the world in 2025.
Yeah, a very relevant, unfortunately timely topic.
Absolutely. We've got all these reports from International Christian Concern, the ICC, some firsthand accounts from people who've actually experienced this persecution. And I guess our mission today is to really understand, where's it the worst? What's driving it? And how does all of this connect back to, historical trends of persecution?
Yeah, I think listeners will find those connections especially fascinating, seeing the patterns, from the past repeating themselves. It's pretty eye-opening.
For sure. So to kick things off, let's jump right into the Global Persecution Index, the GPI.
Yeah, that's a good starting point.
It ranks the top 50 hardest places to be a Christian. And surprise, surprise, sitting at number 1 is North Korea.
Yeah, not unexpected, sadly.
Right. Not a huge shock there, but it's still wild to think about how brutal it is.
Oh, absolutely. The regime's total control, especially over religion, makes it incredibly dangerous for anyone even thinking about stepping outside those lines. Imagine, even just talking about your faith with your own family can get you in serious trouble.
It's insane. It's like this one story about young Jik.
Yeah.
His dad had escaped North Korea, but then got sent back, ended up in prison, converted to Christianity there, and before he died, he wrote on young Jik's hand, I'm following Jesus.
Wow.
And Jing Jik, he ends up converting too, even ends up imprisoned himself for his faith. That's some powerful family legacy.
It really shows how deeply rooted faith can be, even when you're facing unbelievable pressures.
It's incredible and tragic. Okay, moving on. Number 7 on the list, Nigeria. Now, this one surprised me.
Yeah, it's interesting. Africa as a whole, it's got the fastest growing Christian population in the world, yet it's also where the most severe persecution is happening. And Nigeria really embodies that whole situation.
Right, with groups like Boko Haram and ISWAP just wreaking havoc.
It's horrific, the violence they inflict. And what's even more alarming is that the reports from the ICC suggest the government isn't really doing much to stop them. It's almost like these groups are operating with complete impunity.
Yeah, there was a line in one of the reports that really got to me. It said something like, Nigeria is probably the most dangerous place on the planet for Christians because of all the violent extremists.
It paints a really grim picture. And the human cost, it's just devastating. There's a story about Manga, a Nigerian Christian who survived this brutal attack. He talks about how his entire life, his whole village, everything was destroyed. His sense of security, gone. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah. And it's not just the violence, right? It's like what the ICC calls secular Sharia. It doesn't really make sense to me. How can a government claim to be secular, but then implement laws that basically disadvantage Christians?
It's a real contradiction, and it highlights how persecution can manifest in so many ways. Sometimes it's the blatant violent, but other times it's these sneaky laws and social systems designed to keep a specific group down.
It's really messed up. Okay, so then there's Afghanistan. Since the Taliban takeover in 2021, things have gone downhill fast. It went from being somewhat tolerant, even though it was always fragile, to a full-blown crackdown.
Yeah, sadly, the Taliban's strict interpretation of Islamic law leaves practically no room for any other faith. We've got all these reports of Christians going into hiding, risking everything to escape the country. It's a terrible choice. Your faith or your safety.
The ICC actually helped one Christian get out, and his account of just the constant fear, the brutality, it's chilling. And it's not just physical, right? Their whole ideology restricts women, education, their whole social code clashes with Christian beliefs.
It's like this all-encompassing form of persecution that seeps into every corner of life. Living openly as a Christian becomes almost impossible.
It's crazy. All right, switching gears over to Asia, China. Under Xi Jinping, they're really clamping down on religion even harder than before. Their whole sinicization thing is basically about bringing religion under the control of the Communist Party.
Yeah, we're seeing churches demolished, crosses replaced with national flags, pastors arrested for not towing the party line. It's scary.
It's like straight out of a dystopian novel. And what's even more messed up is the technology they're using. Facial recognition cameras in churches, AI tracking religious leaders.
It's like Big Brother on steroids, a perfect example of how technology can be turned against religious freedom.
It really makes you think about the future, Could we see Christians being denied jobs, their kids blocked from schools, all because of their faith? That's terrifying.
It's a subtle form of persecution, but incredibly effective in isolating individuals and silencing them. Okay, so we've got North Korea, Nigeria, Afghanistan, and China. all pretty intense. But what about India? I always thought it was supposed to be more tolerant, but it's number 11 on the GPI.
Yeah, it's a bit of a surprise.
Well, you've hit on a common misconception. While India does have a long history of religious diversity, there's been this really worrying rise in Hindu nationalism, especially under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and that's what's leading to a lot of the persecution we're seeing.
So how's that actually playing out?
Well, there are these groups like the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, or RSS. They're basically at the forefront of this whole Hindu nationalist movement. They see India as a Hindu nation, so Christians and other minorities are seen as a threat.
And that's where the persecution comes in.
Yeah. Think about those anti-conversion laws they have. On paper, they're supposed to prevent forced conversions, which, okay, fair enough. But in reality, they're used to harass Christians just for talking about their faith.
That doesn't seem right at all.
It's not. We're getting reports of pastors being attacked, churches vandalized, all sorts of terrible things.
That's messed up. It sounds like India's not heading in a good direction when it comes to religious freedom.
It's definitely a situation to keep an eye on. Things are volatile. And that Hindu nationalist ideology is creating a real climate of fear and intolerance.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the Middle East. I mean, that's where Christianity started, right? But from what I've heard, it's become a really difficult place for Christians to live.
You're right. The Middle East has incredibly deep roots in Christian history, but the region's Christian population has been shrinking for centuries because of persecution, and unfortunately, that trend is still continuing today.
So which countries are we talking about specifically?
Well, places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are particularly bad.
All right, let's start with Iran. What's going on there?
Well, Iran is an Islamic theocracy, which means the Ayatollah is the top dog, and they have strict Islamic law. Converting from Islam is a huge no-no, and any Christian education is pretty much shut down. It's basically set up to stifle any faith that challenges the dominant Islamic ideology.
And the ICC reports point to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, as playing a major role in all of this.
Right. They're like a religious police force. They raid house churches, arrest pastors, and even torture Christians during interrogations and imprisonment. It's awful. There's a story about Maryam and Marzia, these two Christian women who endured horrible torture in Iran's Avon prison. It's a testament to how strong your faith is, even after going through something unimaginable.
Their story is just heartbreaking, but also inspiring in a way. Okay, so what about Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia is even more strict. Converting to Christianity from Islam is completely illegal and can even get you the death penalty. It's hard to fathom living in a place where you can't even pray quietly without fearing for your life.
That's wild.
The ICC has a story about a Muslim background believer, someone who converted to Christianity, who had to keep his faith a complete secret from his own family. Just imagine the pressure and fear they must live with.
It really makes you appreciate the freedom we have here.
Yep.
Okay, last one in the Middle East, Egypt. What's the situation there?
Egypt has a large Christian population, mainly Coptic Orthodox Christians, but they face a lot of discrimination. Attacks on churches are common, and getting permits to build new ones is almost impossible.
Why is that? Is the government making it difficult?
Well, according to the ICC, the government is turning a blind eye to a lot of this persecution. They rarely hold anyone accountable for attacks on Christians. One quote from the report that stood out to me was, Egypt is basically trying to regulate every aspect of Coptic Christian life. They've created a system where it's almost impossible to build or even renovate churches.
So it's a way of squeezing them out, making it so hard to practice their faith that they just give up.
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's incredibly effective. And then there are the individual stories of suffering, like Maryam, whose husband was murdered by extremists just because he was kind to his Christian neighbors.
It's awful. So we've got these radical Islamic groups in Nigeria, oppressive governments in China and North Korea, rising nationalism in India, and this historical tension in the Middle East. It feels like a global web of persecution, all these different things feeding into each other.
You got it. And what's even more worrying is how technology is being used to amplify all of this. It's like a whole new frontier in the battle for religious freedom.
Okay, before we go any further, I think we should take a moment to acknowledge that this is all pretty heavy stuff. It's important not to get desensitized to it.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get lost in the facts and figures, but it's crucial to remember that these are real people whose lives are being torn apart by this persecution.
Every statistic represents a story of suffering, resilience, and unwavering faith.
And those are the stories that should motivate us to take action. We can't just stand by and watch while our fellow human beings are persecuted for their beliefs.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What can we actually do to help? It feels so huge. Like, how can we possibly make a difference in the face of all this suffering?
It can feel really overwhelming, yeah. But honestly, even small things can make a difference. Like, think about throwing a pebble in a pond. Those ripples spread out far, you know? It's the same idea. Every little action, every voice that speaks up against what's wrong, it creates that ripple effect.
Okay, I like that analogy. But I guess I'm still wondering, like, what are those pebbles? Where do we even start?
The first thing, always, is prayer. I know it might sound cliche, but seriously, never underestimate the power of prayer. Pray for those who are being persecuted, for their protection, their strength, and yeah, even pray for their persecutors.
It's funny you say that because prayer is the one thing we can all do wherever we are, whoever we are. Like, anyone can pray.
Exactly. And it's not just hoping for the best. It's actively praying for a change of heart in those who are persecuting, for them to see the harm they're causing. It's about praying for real transformation, not just a temporary break in the violence.
That's a really good point. Okay, but beyond our own personal prayers, what can we do to make a difference out there in the world?
I think awareness is huge. We need to talk about this, with our friends, our families, our coworkers. Share stories, articles, those ICC reports we talked about. The more people who know what's going on, the less these things can stay hidden. And that puts pressure on those in power to actually do something about it.
Because staying silent, I mean, that's kind of like siding with the oppressors, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Exposing the injustice, shining a light on it, that's half the battle. And then we can actually advocate for real change. Contact your elected officials, urge them to support laws that protect religious freedom, and hold those countries that are violating human rights accountable, maybe through sanctions or something like that.
So using our voices in a way that might actually reach the people who can make decisions, that makes sense. But what about on a more personal level? Like, what can one person do to directly help those who are being persecuted?
One big thing is supporting organizations that are working on the ground, like the ICC. They provide all kinds of practical help, food, shelter, medical care, but they also offer legal aid, trauma counseling, even training on how to survive persecution.
So donating, volunteering, using whatever skills we have to contribute.
Exactly. And here's another thing to think about. We can support businesses and organizations that operate in those countries where persecution is happening. When we buy their products, when we use their services, we're helping to create economic opportunities for the people who are often the targets of this persecution.
That's a great point. It's about using our everyday choices, like where we spend our money, to actually make a difference. So we've got prayer, raising awareness, pushing for political change, supporting those organizations, even being conscious consumers. That's a pretty good starting point, I'd say.
It's all about taking action, not letting this problem paralyze us. It's about remembering that we are all connected and that we have a responsibility to stand up for those who are being persecuted for their faith.
I love that. Okay, well, this has been a really heavy topic, but also, in a strange way, kind of empowering. It's like we've looked at the darkness, but we've also seen the light. We've seen the strength of the human spirit, the power of faith, and how each of us can make a difference.
I agree. And to everyone listening, I'd really encourage you to check out those sources we mentioned, learn more about what's happening in specific situations, the organizations working to help, and then find your own way to get involved.
Because every prayer, every conversation, every action, it all brings us closer to a world where everyone can live out their faith freely, without fear. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another look at something fascinating. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.